It's the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you receive expert fantasy advice for champions. With your host, NFL fantasy football expert, analyst, and draft scout, Lance Goodman. Hello, NFL football fans, fantasy football owners. Welcome back to the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you get expert fantasy advice for champions. As always, I'm your host, NFL fantasy football expert, analyst, and draft scout, Lance Goodman. I have a special show lined up for you today. We are going to go back into August and early September and take a look at round by round what players you should have drafted on your fantasy football teams that should have you in prime position at this point to make a playoff run. That's right, we're going to put our expert GM hats on and take a look at the guys who have been making it happen up till this point in the season. So let's go ahead and get started at the quarterback position. Now, we know the quarterback position is one outside of in this year's draft when you talk about Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Jaden Daniels, Joe Burrow, Josh Allen, our big five. Those were the quarterbacks who were drafted early on, probably around round 3, maybe 2, depending on your league type. But we're going to do this a little bit different, right? We're going to do this position by position. So let's take a look. When you did go and draft a quarterback, and please keep in mind for these segments, I'll reiterate that a few times. Let's keep in mind who you drafted depended on your draft pick position. So in this case, whenever it was that you decided to go and draft a quarterback, let's take a look at the top 10 quarterbacks at this point in the season who, again, should have your team in prime position to make a playoff run. In no set order, we're talking about Drake May of the New England Patriots, Patrick Mahomes of the Kansas City Chiefs, Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles, Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills, Daniel Jones of the Indianapolis Colts, Dak Prescott of the Dallas Cowboys, Matthew Stafford of the Los Angeles Rams, Justin Herbert of the Los Angeles Chargers. Surprisingly, and this one is a waiver wire pickup, so we know that Joe Flacco has not gotten over to Cincinnati, but his 3-week run there has been notable enough to where he is a guy, if he continues to play exactly how he has right now, he certainly deserves to be in that conversation. We'll round it out with Bo Nix of the Denver Broncos. I think when you take a look at that list, let's first take a look at the guys who were inside of our top 10 rankings coming into the season. That would be Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Matthew Stafford, and Patrick Mahomes. The rest of those guys were outside of our top 10. I think when you talk about surprises, most certainly Drake May of the New England Patriots, Daniel Jones of the Indianapolis Colts, and also Joe Flacco of the Cincinnati Bengals. All of those guys are players that you most definitely picked up off the waiver wire unless you had them as a backup quarterback or are in some type of dynasty or deeper league. All right, now let's go ahead and shift our attention over to the running back position. And we know that when we get over here to our running backs, when we talk about our wide receivers, this mix right here were the guys who went off the board first. So again, when it was your draft pick in the first or second round, these are the running backs that you should have staffed if you were an expert GM. We're talking again in no set order: Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts, Devin Achane of the Miami Dolphins, Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons, Christian McCaffrey, the San Francisco 49ers, James Cook of the Buffalo Bills, Javonte Williams of the Dallas Cowboys, Jahmyr Gibbs of the Detroit Lions, Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers, Saquon Barkley of the Philadelphia Eagles, and DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears. Now, when we take a look at those first group of 10 running backs, the guys that we had coming into the season, and by and large, let's just say we know for fantasy football owners, these first set of names were without question guys that you took with your first draft pick when you talked about Bijan Robinson, Christian McCaffrey, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Saquon Barkley. Those guys right there, without question, were coming off the boards fast in the first round. I think when you get late first round, second round, without question, Jonathan Taylor Josh Jacobs, those two guys in particular were there. Devon Achane as well, the Miami Dolphins, and then the guys who have been pleasant surprises who you picked up later in your draft when we talk about DeAndre Swift, Javonte Williams, and then the guy that really stands out here who's been an absolute steal late in that third round, early fourth round in a 10 or 12 man league, and that's going to be James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. Now let's move over to the wide receiver position. Again, depending on where you were drafting, these were the options that were available, but if you were an expert GM, these are the wide receivers that you grab with your first or second pick in your draft. Obviously, Jamar Chase by and large, along with Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, Saquon Barkley in some leagues. But Jamar Chase was the consensus #1 overall pick in your fantasy football draft. And with the way that he's performed this year, there's undoubtedly, we see the reason why. We're also talking about CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions, Emeka Egbuka of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams, Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons, Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears, Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts, and DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers. When you take a look at that list, guys who came into the season ranked in the top 10 were Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Puka Nacua. When you look at the rest of those guys, obviously Emeka Egbuka, the rookie from Tampa Bay, has been a big-time surprise. Picking him up in later rounds definitely got your team off to a hot start. And then also when you look at Rome Odunze, Michael Pittman Jr., DK Metcalf, those were all guys that you picked up later in rounds but have performed at a very high level. So you probably have them as a wide receiver 2 or flex position play. And then I think in those middle rounds, right around round 4 or 5, again in 10 or 12 man leagues, the likes of Drake London. And then the overall leader here is Jackson Smith-Njigba. So what great value that you're getting there. Now let's move on to those other set of wide receivers that you should have been taking with your second wide receiver pick. When we talk about Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins, Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens, Cortland Sutton of the Denver Broncos, Devonta Adams of the Los Angeles Rams, Tatoria McMillan of the Carolina Panthers, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings, George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys, and Deebo Samuel of the Washington Commanders. Now, some of those guys, all right, so let's go ahead and highlight the guys who, even though you grabbed them later, a lot of these guys have given you wide receiver 1 value for quite a few weeks. When you talk about George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys, the damage he did while CeeDee Lamb was out with an injury. Zay Flowers started off the season extremely consistent. Some great #2 receivers. When you talk about Cortland Sutton out in Denver, Devonta Adams out for the Los Angeles Rams, Justin Jefferson has certainly had some good game. The same holds true for Deebo Samuel. I'd say the first month of the season, he most certainly pumped in some big numbers for you. We know that Jalen Waddle has become a consistent receiver once that injury happened and Tyreek Hill to take him out. Khalil Shakir giving you some great late round value. The same holds true for rookie Tatoria McMillan of the Carolina Panthers, who has been a steady and consistent play. All right, so those guys right there, that group right there, should have comprised your first 3 rounds. If you are an expert GM, those are the guys that you started your foundation of your roster with and have been pumping in the big numbers. This should have got you off to a fast start. All right, look, we're going to run to another quick break. When we come back, we're going to do this again and move our attention over to rounds 4 through 7. So don't you go anywhere. It's the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show. fans, fantasy football owners, welcome back to the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you get expert fantasy advice for champions. Let's not waste any time and jump back into our special show today where, again, we are going expert GM mode. We are 8 weeks into the NFL fantasy football season, which means we're right at the halfway point. And what we're doing on our special show today is going back into August, going back into early September when you did your live draft, and we are going expert GM mode, meaning we're taking a look at the players who have been pumping in the big numbers, who have been consistent, who should have your teams in position to make the playoffs and potentially make a deep playoff run. Once again, keep in mind I'm prefacing these segments by letting owners know these picks obviously are depending on what draft position you had. Also, if this was a 10 to 12 man league is what we're usually using here, full point PPR. All right, so let's go ahead and jump back in and take a look now at rounds 4 through 6 if you were drafting the guys who should be on your football team. All right, now we're going to start with a couple guys who are out, and actually 3 of them. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens, Jaden Daniels of the Washington Commanders. Both of those guys were consensus top 5 rated fantasy football quarterbacks. We know that they came off the boards in rounds 1 through 3, but both of those guys have been injured and has had them out just about as much time as they have played this year. And so if they had played the entire season, there's no doubt that they would have been lumped in with that first group of quarterbacks. But at this point, they have not been able to do as much damage for you as they could have because they've been out. But once they come back, we expect for those guys to potentially jump back up into that top 10 when we do our final rankings heading to the playoffs. But right now, based on what they've done, which again has had them out injured a lot, you would have wanted to grab them a little bit later, probably around round 4 or 5. The same is going to hold true for Brock Purdy of the San Francisco 49ers, expected to have a big year, was ranked right inside of or outside of our top 10, has only played in 2 games this year, so he really hasn't done much for you. But when he gets back healthy in his full cast of players, he's another guy right along with Lamar Jackson, right along with Jaden Daniels, who certainly is a proven commodity in fantasy football. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our other guys when we talk about Jared Goff of the Detroit Lions, Sam Darnold of the Seattle Seahawks, Baker Mayfield of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Caleb Williams of the Chicago Bears, Jordan Love of the Green Bay Packers, CJ Stroud of the Houston Texans, and Michael Penix Jr. of the Atlanta Falcons. Now, let's go ahead and split this list in half, okay? When we take a look at Sam Darnold, Jared Goff, Baker Mayfield, Caleb Williams, all 4 of those guys have had some huge games this year that were instrumental in your teams getting some wins this year. Those guys certainly have proven themselves to be a starter for your fantasy football team. But when you take a look at Jared Goff, numbers have been a little bit inconsistent. And then we know with the injury suffered to that Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receiver corps, you've seen Baker Mayfield's numbers come way down from what they were the first month of the season. When you look at Jordan Love, CJ Stroud, Michael Penix Jr., it's been a matter of hit or miss. But of the group of quarterbacks, those have been the next group of guys that have been best available. Now let's go ahead and move over to the running back position. Let's take a look at the running back that you should have been grabbing in rounds late 3rd, but really 4 through 6. When you talk about J.K. Dobbins of the Denver Broncos, Breece Hall of the New York Jets, Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams, Derrick Henry of the Baltimore Ravens, Ashton Jeanty of the Las Vegas Raiders, Quinshon Judkins of the Cleveland Browns, Jaylen Warren of the Pittsburgh Steelers, Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars, Bucky Irvin of the Tampa Bay Bucks, and Omarion Hampton of the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, we've got some things we need to sort out here, okay? First and foremost, let's take a look at the guys who were ranked inside of your top 10 coming into the season, but due to performance at this point in the season, this is where you want to have draft them at in rounds probably 4 or 5. When you take a look at both Derrick Henry, Ashton Jeanty, Kyren Williams, all 3 of those guys, along with Bucky Irvin, and I think you can even lump in Omarion Hampton, even though he wasn't inside of my top 10, was inside of my top 15, but came into the season possibly going to be in a committee. But without question, when you talk about Kyren Williams, Derrick Henry, Ashton Jeanty, Bucky Irvin, for sure, all of those guys were inside of my top 10. And let me apologize, Ashton Jeanty, I think I had him ranked right around 13. But when you did your fantasy football draft, all of those guys were ranked inside of the top 10, okay? Still, all of these guys are excellent performers. I think all of these guys still have an opportunity to have monster years, especially when you talk about Derrick Henry once Lamar Jackson comes back from injury. You talk about Bucky Irvin, who's been out with an injury for the last month or so. We know he's a big-time performer. I think the same holds true for Kyren Williams. I think the Rams have been kind of making sure that he's going to be healthy down the stretch run and certainly in the playoffs. If any of those guys I have some concern about, it's going to be a matchup-based play. It's going to be Ashton Jeanty of the Las Vegas Raiders. And then when Omarion Hampton is fully back healthy, once he gets the full workload, he's a guy who's going to pump in the big numbers as well. When we take a look at the rest of these guys, I think that's exactly where you took them in your drafts. When you're talking about J.K. Dobbins of the Denver Broncos, Breece Hall of the New York Jets, Quinshon Judkins of the Cleveland Browns, Jaylen Warren of the Pittsburgh Steelers, Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars. You know, committees were surrounding all of those guys' names when it came to your live draft. We weren't sure if J.K. Dobbins was going to get the full workload out for the Denver Broncos. Certainly some speculation with Breece Hall splitting that workload with Braylon Allen. Quinshon Judkins didn't even start week 1 due to his contract situation. Jaylen Warren certainly was a guy you were picking up in round 6 or 7 just due to how the draft was flowing. And then Travis Etienne certainly had some speculation around his name possibly being in a committee with Tank Bigsby. Once the dust settled, all of those guys now getting the full workload and were the next best set of running backs to get in your draft. Now let's go ahead and move over to the wide receiver position, all right? So in rounds 4 through 6, again, in no set order, depending on where you were drafting from, these were the wide receivers based on production at this point in the season that you would have gotten on your team. When we talk about Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals, Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles, Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins, Malik Nabers of the New York Giants, Stephon Diggs of the Buffalo Bills. Now, obviously, when you take a look at that list, we know that Malik Nabers, Tyreek Hill, A.J. Brown, all of those guys were ranked inside of our top 10 receivers. Unfortunately, for Tyreek Hill and Malik Nabers, their season came to an end early due to injuries. A.J. Brown off to a slow start, finally got it going the last couple weeks. He's currently out right now. We know that Rashee Rice was a steal in this draft, a guy that you drafted, again, in rounds 6 through 8, but grabbed for the reason you're seeing now, being highly productive, kind of as a late season stash. No surprise about guys with wide receiver 2 value like Devonta Smith, T. Higgins, Garrett Wilson, Mike Evans, also a guy who suffered a broken collarbone, going to be out an extended period of time. I think Stephon Diggs has been a pleasant surprise in later rounds, and then rounding out your group of wide receivers. So now probably receivers you're adding on your depth chart somewhere around in that wide receiver 3, 4. We're starting to get into some depth when we talk about Kayshon Boutte of the New England Patriots, Nico Collins, Ladd McConkey, Marvin Harrison Jr., Jordan Addison, Wan'Dale Robinson, Rashid Shaheed, Xavier Worthy, Brian Thomas Jr., and Terry McLaurin. We know that there are some disappointments in that list. Terry McLaurin, a guy rated much higher, spent a lot of the time out due to injury. Brian Thomas has been somewhat of a disappointment, struggling with drops. Some guys who have been pleasant surprises when you look at the consistent play of Rashid Shaheed based on where you drafted him or probably picked him up off the waiver wire. The same would hold true for Kayshon Boutte as well as Wan'Dale Robinson. Guys you picked up off the waiver wire who certainly have been some viable plays. And then we know that Marvin Harrison Jr. has been a bit of a disappointment. Ladd McConkey has gotten it going lately. And then Xavier Worthy certainly picked up the slack while Rashee Rice was out. But he's another guy who missed a lot of the beginning of the season with that injury as well. All right, look, that is going to wrap up this segment. We're going to run to another quick break. When we come back, it'll be more of the extra points right here on the Clear Production Sport Network. football owners, welcome back to the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show. Before we hop into our final segment of the day, please don't forget to follow me on social media. Make sure you check me out over on Facebook, over on Twitter, over on Instagram. That's facebook.com/NFL Exporter. Over on Twitter, you can find me at the handle NFL Exporter as well. And then over on Instagram, the handle is at UFCATL, which stands for Ultimate Football Club ATL. Please make sure you give me a follow on my social media. I drop tons of great information and advice and priceless gems like you're receiving today all over the internet, so you don't want to miss a thing. All right, let's go ahead and jump into our final segment of the day. Now we're working our way into rounds 7 through 10, basically the way that you wanted to round out the foundation pieces of your draft before we got into the later rounds, where you're basically getting that quality depth, looking for some late round value, looking for some steals, getting that defensive special teams and things like that in order, okay? So again, a lot of these players that we're going to discuss now, especially at the quarterback position, are going to be guys that you would have had as backups, guys you picked up off the waiver wire that have been viable plays at the right place at the right time. And then obviously at the running back, wide receiver, and we're going to lump in that tight end position as well. These are the guys who also have been rounding out your lineup to make it happen. Let's go ahead and start over at the quarterback position. I'm not going to list all of these quarterbacks, only the ones who have been productive in the right place at the right time or a disappointment. So when you look at Aaron Rodgers of the Pittsburgh Steelers, Jackson Dart of the New York Giants, Bryce Young of the Carolina Panthers, Justin Fields of the New York Jets, those guys in particular, if you were able to catch them at the right place at the right time in your lineup, certainly have had some big notable games. We know that Aaron Rodgers had a 4-touchdown game at the Cincinnati Bengals. We know that Jackson Dart got off to a hot start. You look at his big games at home against the Eagles, on the road against the Denver Broncos. We know that Bryce Young in some spot plays, especially on the road at Arizona when they had to come from behind, put in some big numbers, and as well against that Dallas Cowboys defense. And then you also look at Justin Fields, what he was able to do in week 1 against the Pittsburgh Steelers and this past weekend against the Cincinnati Bengals. So if you were able to catch those guys at the right place at the right time, they certainly did some positive things for your fantasy football teams. But at this point, still are what you're going to be looking at as your backup quarterbacks, or if there's a juicy matchup, an injury or a bye week, those will be your top options based on matchup. I think a disappointment by far is going to be Kyler Murray of the Arizona Cardinals. Has missed the last couple games with an injury, but even when he was in, we just never had a signature Kyler Murray game so far this year. I think based on expectation, Trevor Lawrence continues to underwhelm, and then the guy who sticks out like a sore thumb here is going to be Tua Tagovailoa of the Miami Dolphins. Simply continues to struggle with turnovers, although he has had a couple decent games. Now let's get back over into our running backs, okay? So now we're talking about round 7 through 10, some guys that you would have scooped up, again, based on what the production has looked like through the first 8 weeks of the season. We're going to start with a couple guys who are out for the rest of the season, and unfortunately that is going to hold true for rookie Cam Scatterboo of the New York Giants. Was just such a fun and enjoyable player to watch. Would have become very productive, and honestly, if it wasn't for this injury, he's a guy who I would have further up in my rankings, but suffered a dislocated ankle, is going to miss the rest of the season. We hope he gets a speedy return, but he was an absolute beast and a guy that a lot of owners were picking up as a handcuff or expecting him maybe to take over at some point in that New York Giants backfield. We know that James Conner, when he's fully healthy, always finds himself somewhere around the top 15 fantasy football running backs. Went out early for the rest of the season, very early for the Arizona Cardinals as well. You look at Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals, David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions, Rico Dowdell of the Carolina Panthers, Isaiah Pacheco of the Kansas City Chiefs, Jordan Mason of the Minnesota Vikings, Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt of the Washington Commanders, Alvin Kamara of the New Orleans Saints. Then we got some committees here still with Kenneth Walker III for the Seattle Seahawks, along with Zach Charbonnet. Both Ramondre Stevenson and Travion Henderson continue to share that workload for the New England Patriots. And then it had been Tony Pollard for most of the year out in Tennessee. But once Tyjae Spears came back off the injured reserve list, has found himself back in the mold. When we talk about disappointments, Chase Brown is a guy who stands out more than anything, but we knew that once starting quarterback Joe Burrow went out with an injury, that was going to kind of put a cap on his numbers. But you guys have heard me talk about this on the show before, and it most certainly came to fruition. he turned into a matchup-based play in the past 2 weeks against a bad Pittsburgh Steelers defense, against a bad New York Jets defense. He was worth a start and pumped in some big numbers for your fantasy football team. Very encouraging for fantasy football owners of Chase Brown. Now that Joe Flacco's at quarterback, it seems like that offense is back on track. Another big surprise we have here, Rico Dowdle of the Carolina Panthers had some monster games for Carolina while starter Chuba Hubbard was out with an injury. Word that I'm getting this week is that the Carolina Panthers have fully committed to Rico Dowdle in terms of giving him the full workload, so he could end up being one of those precious waiver wire pickups, along with a guy like Kamani Vidal, who's serving time right now in there for Omarion Hampton for the Los Angeles Chargers. Both of those guys have become full-time starters and I think could pay some big-time dividends. We also seen that Jordan Mason, with the early injury to Aaron Jones, was able to pump in some nice numbers for you at the right place at the right time. And then also Alvin Kamara, without question, has been a big disappointment. Just not much going out there for that New Orleans Saints offense. If you were able to catch David Montgomery of the Detroit Lions at the right times in some games, he's certainly a guy who held a lot of late round value as well. Now let's move over to the wide receiver position again. We're in round 7 through 10 right now. Again, some of these guys we picked up recently off the waiver wire, but we really want to kind of mesh everything in and really look at the state of affairs at where we are right now. When we're talking about an expert GM, we know that that waiver wire is a big piece of the puzzle. So again, in no set order, Tez Johnson of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, a starter now with Mike Evans out, with Chris Godwin out, has become a primary target next to Emeka Egbuka for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Romeo Doubs seems to be the most consistent play out in Green Bay. DJ Moore, Quentin Johnston, Keenan Allen, Troy Franklin, Trey Tucker, Jawan Jennings, Kendrick Bourne, and Travis Hunter. Let's go ahead and talk about those guys real quickly. We know that DJ Moore has certainly been a disappointment. Let's hope his 5-catch, 73-yard performance this past week for Chicago against the Ravens can get him more back into the fold. Keenan Allen, Quentin Johnston for the Chargers both got off to a hot start, but lately it's been Ladd McConkey and new tight end Gadsden starting to really make their mark. So both of those guys' production is down a bit. Trey Franklin, if you were able to catch him in the right place in the right time for the Denver Broncos, certainly has had some meaningful games out in San Francisco with the array of injuries they have had. It's been a mixture of Kendrick Bourne, Ricky Pearsall, or Juwan Jennings, whoever you could catch on the right day. And then Travis Hunter, expected to be more of that Jacksonville offense, had a big game in London against the Los Angeles Rams. Let's certainly hope he can keep it going. And then let's slide over to the tight end position real quickly. And again, this was all about preference. So when we look at your top 8 tight ends, we know that Brock Bowers, Trey McBride, those were the 2 tight ends who were going early second round, third round. Brock Bowers has been out with an injury the majority of the year, so having paid dividends. Trey McBride, I think, is living up to expectation. The other tight ends who you would have grabbed in your first pick, again, depending on where you were drafting from, rookie Tyler Warren for the Indianapolis Colts has been doing his thing. Jake Ferguson has been an absolute stud for the Dallas Cowboys. George Kittle was another high-profile name that spent a lot of time out on the injured reserve list with that hamstring injury. Tucker Kraft of the Green Bay Packers, Dallas Goedert of the Philadelphia Eagles. Both of those guys have had some monster games so far this season. And then how about Kyle Pitts Sr. getting back into the fold, has been a very consistent play in full-point PPR. Your next set of tight ends that you would have taken off the board in later rounds would have been Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots. Rookie Harold Fanning Jr. has been a pleasant surprise when he's been healthy. Evan Ingram of the Denver Broncos. We know that Travis Kelce certainly deserves merit up there with the top-tier guys as well. Sam Laporta, Dalton Kincaid, when you've been able to catch them on the right week. TJ Hawkinson of the Minnesota Vikings got off to a slow start. Seemed like when Carson Wentz got in that quarterback for a brief period of time, his numbers went up. And then the guy who most certainly right now off the waiver wire list, outside of Harold Fanning Jr., who has been a big-time player, and that is Oronde Gadsden II for the Los Angeles Chargers. Seems like he is going to be a major player in that Chargers offense and for your fantasy football team as well. All right, that is going to wrap up our show for today. I hope you guys enjoyed. I expect to see you right back here, same place, same time. It's the Extra Points Fantasy Football Show, the place where you get expert fantasy advice for champions. Let's go.